The billionaire's twin sons cried every night until the new maid did the unthinkable. The $1 million penthouse felt like a tomb at 2:47 a.m. Damian Whitmore stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows, watching Seattle's skyline blur through the rain-streaked glass. His reflection stared back, a man who'd built an empire but couldn't fix what mattered most. The city below pulsed with life while his home suffocated in silence, broken only by the distant sound that had become his nightly torment. Crying. Again. His 3-year-old twins, Liam and Lucas, were awake in their bedroom down the hall, and their sobs echoed through the marble corridors like accusations. Damian's jaw tightened as he checked his Rolex. The 4th babysitter this month had quit yesterday, muttering something about impossible children and more than she bargained for. They weren't impossible before, he thought, his fingers unconsciously touching the wedding ring he still wore. Before the accident. Before everything changed. The crying intensified and Damian closed his eyes. 18 months. 18 months since Isabella's car had skidded on black ice. Since the phone call that shattered his carefully constructed world. He'd handled business crises, hostile takeovers, billion-dollar negotiations, but 2 grieving toddlers. They were his greatest failure. His phone buzzed. A text from his assistant. New housekeeper starts tomorrow. Nora Bailey. References excellent. Hope this one works out. Damian almost laughed. Another stranger to walk through his doors, judge his parenting, and leave when things got difficult. They all did. The nannies, the housekeepers, the well-meaning family friends who promised to help but disappeared when the reality hit. He walked toward his home office. Expensive Italian leather shoes silent against the Persian rug Isabella had chosen. Everything in this place was perfect, curated, pristine. Everything except the 3 human beings trying to survive inside it. The crying had stopped, replaced by a worse sound, hiccuping whimpers that meant his boys had exhausted themselves into that fitful, restless sleep that would last maybe 2 hours before starting again. Damian paused outside their bedroom door, his hand hovering over the handle. Through the crack, he could see their small forms huddled together in one bed, clutching each other like shipwreck survivors. Liam's thumb was in his mouth, a habit that had returned after the funeral. Lucas held their mother's scarf, the one that still smelled faintly of her perfume. I should go in, he told himself. I should comfort them. But the words Isabella used to whisper to them, the songs she'd hum, the gentle way she'd stroke their hair, he couldn't replicate any of it. Every time he tried, he saw her absence more clearly, felt the weight of everything he couldn't give them. So he walked past their door, as he had every night for 18 months. In his office, Damian pulled up the security camera feeds on his computer, a habit he'd developed to monitor the parade of caregivers who'd come and gone. The boys' room showed 2 small figures finally still, their breathing visible in the soft glow of the nightlight. Tomorrow, another stranger would enter their lives. Another person who would eventually realize that grief wasn't something you could organize, manage, or solve with a hefty paycheck. His phone rang. Business call from Hong Kong. Damian answered on the first ring, grateful for something he actually knew how to handle. As he discussed international property acquisitions, his eyes remained fixed on the monitor showing his sleeping sons. He had no idea that tomorrow would bring the woman who would change everything, not through expertise or training, but through something far more powerful and impossible to buy. And in 12 hours, when Nora Bailey first heard those cries echoing through his perfect house, she would do the one thing no one else had thought to try. She would simply stay. She wasn't what he expected. Nora Bailey stood in the marble foyer of the Whitmore penthouse at exactly 8 a.m., her worn canvas bag slung over one shoulder, and her green eyes taking in the opulent surroundings without a trace of intimidation. Where other housekeepers had seemed overwhelmed by the grandeur, she simply nodded politely and waited. Damian studied her from the top of the spiral staircase, still in his suit from yesterday's late-night business calls. 29, his assistant had said, though something in her steady gaze suggested she'd lived more than her years. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore plain jeans and a soft blue sweater. Nothing fancy, but everything about her seemed present, grounded. Mr. Whitmore? Her voice carried a slight southern accent, warm but professional. I'm Nora Bailey. He descended the stairs, noting how she didn't fidget or look around nervously like the others had. Ms. Bailey, thank you for coming. I assume my assistant explained the challenges of this position? She mentioned you have twin boys who've been having a difficult time. Nora's tone was matter-of-fact, not pitying. "I'm sorry for your loss." The simple acknowledgement hit harder than all the elaborate condolences he'd received from business associates. Most people either avoided mentioning Isabella entirely or offered hollow platitudes. Nora had simply stated a truth and moved on. "The boys are in the breakfast room with their current nanny," Damien said, leading her through the house. "Mrs. Henderson has been adequate during the day, but the nights are—" He trailed off, unsure how to explain the chaos without sounding like a complete failure as a father. "Rough," Nora finished gently. "Grief doesn't follow a schedule." They entered the breakfast room, where a tired-looking woman in her 50s was attempting to coax Liam and Lucas to eat their oatmeal. The boys sat slumped in their high-end booster seats, listless and pale, dark circles under their eyes that made Damien's chest tighten. "Boys," Mrs. Henderson said with forced cheer. "This is Miss Nora. She's going to help take care of the house." Both children looked up with the wariness of those who'd learned not to get attached. Liam tucked his thumb into his mouth, while Lucas clutched a small toy car, the last gift Isabella had given him. Nora crouched down to their eye level, her movements slow and non-threatening. "Hi, Liam." "Hi, Lucas." Her voice was soft, respectful. "That's a really cool car, Lucas. Does it go fast?" Lucas blinked, surprised to be addressed directly. Most adults talked over them or around them, discussing their issues as if they weren't there. He held up the car slightly. "Very fast," he whispered. "I bet it is. And Liam, I like your dinosaur shirt. Is that a T-Rex?" Liam pulled his thumb out long enough to nod. "Roar," he said quietly, making a tiny claw with his free hand. Nora smiled. Not the exaggerated fake brightness most people used with grieving children, but something genuine and warm. "That's a good roar. Very scary." For the first time in weeks, Liam almost smiled back. Damien watched this interaction with growing amazement. In 30 seconds, Nora had accomplished what trained professionals had failed to do in months. She'd gotten his sons to engage. "Mrs. Henderson, why don't you take the morning off?" Damien said suddenly. "Ms. Bailey can get acquainted with the house routine." As the day progressed, Damien found himself making excuses to check on Nora's work. He'd told himself it was standard procedure, monitoring a new employee, but the truth was more complicated. She moved through their home like she belonged there, not trying to impose order but simply being present. She sang softly while folding laundry, hummed while preparing lunch. When Liam spilled grape juice on his shirt, she didn't scold or fuss. She just cleaned it up and helped him change, telling him about a time she'd spilled an entire chocolate milkshake on herself at age 5. But it was around 6 p.m. that Damien truly understood what made Nora different. He was in his office when he heard it. Lucas laughing. Actually laughing. Damien looked up from his contract, certain he'd imagined it. When had he last heard that sound? He found them in the living room. Nora was on her hands and knees, pretending to be a monster while the boys attacked her with foam blocks. She was making ridiculous growling noises and dramatically falling every time they hit her. "Oh no," she cried in mock terror. "The brave knights are too strong. I surrender." Both boys were giggling now, their faces brighter than Damien had seen them since the funeral. Liam had abandoned his thumb entirely, too caught up in the game to need that comfort. Damien leaned against the doorframe, transfixed. This was what their house had sounded like before, filled with laughter, with life, with the kind of joy he'd forgotten was possible. Nora caught sight of him and smiled. "Your daddy's home," she told the boys. "Maybe he wants to help defeat the monster." Liam and Lucas turned to him with hopeful eyes, and for a moment, Damien felt the familiar panic. He didn't know how to play, how to be the father they needed. But then Nora gave him the smallest nod, an encouragement that seemed to say, "Just try." And as night fell over Seattle, something shifted in the Whitmore house. Something that would change everything. At 11:47 p.m., the house held its breath. Nora finished wiping down the granite countertops in the kitchen, her first day officially complete. The dishwasher hummed quietly, and moonlight filtered through the massive windows, casting silver patterns across the floor. She should have been exhausted. The penthouse was enormous, and she'd spent hours learning routines, locations, the particular way Mr. Whitmore liked his coffee prepared. But she wasn't tired. She was listening. Upstairs, the boys had gone to bed 3 hours ago. Mrs. Henderson had handled bedtime as usual, with her efficient but detached approach. Brush teeth, put on pajamas, quick story, lights out. No lingering, no extra comfort, just the necessary steps to get through another night. Nora gathered her things, preparing to head to her small studio apartment across town when she heard it. A whimper. Soft, muffled, but unmistakable. She paused at the bottom of the staircase, her hand on the marble banister. The sound came again. Not quite crying yet, but the prelude to it. The kind of sound that meant a child was trying desperately not to wake anyone, fighting against the terror that came with darkness. Not your responsibility, she told herself. Mrs. Henderson handles nights. You're just the housekeeper. But her feet were already moving up the stairs. The crying started in earnest as she reached the second floor. Not one voice, but two, harmonizing in shared anguish. Nora followed the sound down the wide hallway, past expensive artwork that probably cost more than she'd make in 5 years, until she reached a partially open door. Through the gap, she could see them. Liam and Lucas had somehow ended up in the same bed again, clinging to each other in the middle of the king-sized mattress that dwarfed their small bodies. Liam's thumb was back in his mouth, but it wasn't providing the comfort he sought. Lucas held his mother's scarf pressed against his face, breathing in a scent that grew fainter every day. They were trying to be quiet, these babies who'd learned that their pain was a burden others couldn't bear. Nora's heart cracked open. She pushed the door open gently and stepped inside. "Hey there, little ones." Both boys looked up, startled. In the soft glow of their nightlight, their faces were streaked with tears, their eyes wide with the kind of fear that had nothing to do with monsters under the bed, and everything to do with the monster of loss that lived in their chests. "Miss Nora," Lucas whispered, "we're being good. We're trying to be quiet." The words hit her like a physical blow. Trying to be quiet. What 3-year-old should have to apologize for crying? "Oh, sweetheart," she murmured, moving closer to the bed. "You don't have to be quiet. You're allowed to cry when you're sad. But Daddy gets that look," Liam mumbled around his thumb. "And the ladies leave." Nora knelt beside the bed, her eyes level with theirs. "What kind of look?" "Like his tummy hurts," Lucas explained. "Like when we're loud, it makes him remember Mommy more, and remembering makes him go to his office and stay there." The insight from such young children was devastating. They'd learned to suppress their grief to protect their fathers, creating a house where everyone suffered in isolation. "Can I sit with you for a minute?" Nora asked softly. Both boys nodded eagerly, scooting over to make room. Nora settled onto the edge of the mattress, and immediately, both children gravitated toward her warmth. Not demanding, just hoping. "You know what?" she said, smoothing Liam's unruly hair. "Sometimes when I was little and couldn't sleep, my grandma would tell me that nighttime was when we could feel closest to the people we love who aren't here anymore. Because in the quiet, we could really listen for them." "Can we listen for Mommy?" Lucas asked, his voice barely a whisper. "We can try. But first let me tell you about a little boy I knew who had the bravest heart." Nora began to speak, her voice low and soothing, weaving a story about courage and love and how sometimes the strongest thing you can do is let yourself feel sad. As she talked, her hands moved gently, stroking hair, rubbing small backs, providing the tactile comfort both boys craved. Gradually their breathing slowed, their small bodies relaxed against her sides. Liam's thumb slipped from his mouth as sleep finally claimed him. Lucas held his mother's scarf loosely now, no longer clutching it like a lifeline. Nora continued to sit there long after they'd fallen asleep, afraid to move and break the peace. This was what they needed. Not someone to make them stop crying, but someone to stay while they cried. Someone to witness their pain and not run from it. She was so focused on the boys that she didn't notice the figure in the doorway until he spoke. "How long have you been here?" Nora looked up to find Damien standing in the entrance to the room, still in his suit but with his tie loosened, his hair mussed as if he'd been running his hands through it. His expression was unreadable in the dim light. "I was leaving," she whispered, careful not to wake the children. "But I heard them crying and I'm sorry. I know this isn't my job. I just couldn't. Don't apologize." His voice was rough, strange. "They're actually sleeping." "Yes." "Peacefully." "Yes." Damien stepped into the room, moving with the careful quiet of someone who'd learned not to disturb fragile moments. He looked down at his sons, nestled against Nora like she was their safe harbor, and something in his face shifted. "The last nanny who tried to comfort them at night quit the next day," he said quietly. "Said they were inconsolable, that there was something wrong with them that required professional intervention." Nora's jaw tightened. "There's nothing wrong with them. They're grieving. They're 3 years old and they lost their mother and everyone expects them to just cope, and I don't know how to help them." The admission hung in the air between them, raw, honest, Devastating. You help them by being their father, Nora said gently. By staying, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Damien was quiet for a long moment, watching his sleeping sons. Would you? He began, then stopped. Started again. Would you consider staying tonight? Just to make sure they don't wake up afraid again? Nora looked at him, this powerful man who commanded boardrooms and built empires, asking for help with the thing that mattered most. Of course, she said. And as dawn crept across Seattle's skyline, something fundamental shifted in the Whitmore house. For the first time in 18 months, everyone slept through the night. Damien woke to a sound he'd almost forgotten existed in his house. Giggling. He checked his phone. 7:23 a.m. For the first time in 18 months, he'd slept past 6 a.m. without being awakened by crying. The silence had been so complete that he'd actually overslept. Following the voices, he found himself drawn to the kitchen, where an impossible scene unfolded before him. Nora stood at the stove, her blonde hair catching the morning sunlight streaming through the windows. She wore the same clothes from yesterday. She'd clearly never left, but somehow she looked perfectly at home. Liam sat perched on the counter beside her, carefully dropping blueberries into what appeared to be pancake batter, while Lucas stood on a step stool, wielding a whisk with the intense concentration of a master chef. Not too fast, Lucas, Nora was saying, her hand gently guiding his. We want to make the bubbles dance, not attack them. Like this? Lucas asked, slowing his movements. Perfect. And Liam, those are beautiful blueberries. Should we add a few more? Liam nodded enthusiastically, his thumb nowhere in sight. Both boys looked awake, alert, present in a way Damien hadn't seen since before the accident. Daddy! Lucas spotted him first, waving the whisk excitedly. We're making breakfast. Miss Nora is teaching us. Damien stepped into the kitchen, feeling oddly like an intruder in his own home. This domestic scene was so foreign to their usual routine of silent, efficient meal preparation that he wasn't sure how to respond. I hope you don't mind, Nora said, her cheeks flushing slightly. They woke up early, and I thought they might enjoy helping. Helping is good, Damien said carefully, but they've never. Mrs. Henderson usually handles. Mrs. Henderson makes rules, Liam interrupted with 3-year-old bluntness. No touching, no mess, no fun. Liam, Damien started to correct him, but Nora laughed, a warm, infectious sound that filled the kitchen. Well, sometimes a little mess leads to the best memories, she said, ruffling Liam's hair. Besides, these pancakes are going to be extra special because you helped make them. As if summoned by the mention of her name, Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway, her expression shifting from confusion to barely concealed horror as she took in the scene. Flour dusted the normally pristine counters. A few blueberries had escaped their bowl, and there were small handprints on the cabinet doors. Mr. Whitmore, she said stiffly, I can take over from here. Boys, you need to wash your hands and get dressed properly for breakfast. The change in the children was immediate and heartbreaking. Their shoulders slumped, their excitement dimmed, and they began to climb down from their positions with the resigned acceptance of those accustomed to having joy interrupted. Actually, Damien heard himself say, let them finish. Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows shot up. Sir? The pancakes. Let them finish making the pancakes. Nora shot him a grateful look that did something strange to his chest. The boys perked up again, Lucas resuming his careful whisking while Liam continued his important blueberry duty. But the mess, Mrs. Henderson protested. Can be cleaned, Damien finished. It's just flour. Mrs. Henderson pursed her lips but said nothing more, though her disapproval filled the kitchen like fog. 20 minutes later they sat around the breakfast table, actually together, for the first time since Isabella's death. The pancakes were slightly lopsided and probably contained too many blueberries, but the boys ate them with the satisfaction of having created something wonderful. These are the best pancakes ever, Lucas declared, syrup coating his chin. Even better than Mommy's? Liam asked, then immediately looked stricken, as if he'd broken an unspoken rule about mentioning their mother. The kitchen fell silent. Mrs. Henderson looked uncomfortable. Damien felt that familiar tightness in his chest, the urge to change the subject, to protect everyone from the pain of memory. But Nora leaned forward, her voice gentle but clear. You know what I think? I think Mommy would be really proud that you learned to make pancakes. She'd probably want to know all about how you helped, every detail. Liam's eyes widened. Really? Really? People we love don't stop loving us when they're not here anymore. They want us to keep learning new things, keep having adventures, keep being happy. Don't you think so? Both boys nodded solemnly, as if this was the most important truth they'd ever heard. Damien stared at Nora across the table, amazed. In a few simple sentences, she'd done what therapists and grief counselors had failed to accomplish. She'd given his sons permission to live fully, while still honoring their mother's memory. After breakfast, Mrs. Henderson took the boys to get dressed, muttering under her breath about disrupted routines and inappropriate boundaries. Damien lingered in the kitchen with Nora as she cleaned up the breakfast dishes. "Thank you," he said finally, "for last night, for this morning, for, I don't know how to say it." Nora paused in her dishwashing, turning to face him. "You don't have to thank me for caring about them. They're wonderful boys. They are. They're also," he struggled for words, "they haven't been themselves since Isabella died. I hired professionals, child psychologists, grief specialists, the best nannies money could buy. None of them could reach them the way you did in one night. Maybe that's because I wasn't trying to fix them," Nora said quietly. "They're not broken, Mr. Whitmore, they're just sad. And sometimes the best thing you can do for someone who's sad is just be sad with them for a while." Before Damien could respond, his phone rang. Business emergency in Chicago, the kind that usually sent him into crisis management mode, consuming his entire day. But as he answered the call, watching Nora hum softly while she worked, listening to his son's laughter echoing from upstairs, something stopped him. "Actually," he told his assistant, "handle it. I'm staying home today." For the first time in 18 months, Damien Whitmore had found something more important than work. And across the kitchen, Nora smiled like she understood exactly what that meant. 3 weeks later, Damien found himself doing something he never thought possible. He was playing hide-and-seek in his own garden. "Ready or not, here I come," he called out, listening to muffled giggles coming from behind the ornamental fountain. The sound still caught him off guard. How quickly laughter had returned to their lives. How natural it felt now. Nora had been the catalyst, but she'd done something even more remarkable than healing his sons. She'd taught him how to be their father again. It had started small. That first day he'd stayed home, she'd suggested he join them for their afternoon walk around the building's rooftop garden. "They love showing off what they know," she'd said simply. "And they know a lot." She'd been right. Lucas had enthusiastically explained every flower they passed, while Liam had demonstrated his impressive knowledge of construction equipment by pointing out every crane visible from their 20th floor view. Damien had found himself actually listening, not just waiting for the conversation to end so he could return to his emails, but genuinely interested in his son's perspectives on the world. "Found you," he announced now, discovering both boys crammed behind a planter, still giggling despite being caught. "Again, again," Liam demanded, already running toward a new hiding spot. "In a minute," Damien said, settling onto the garden bench where Nora sat reading a book, her presence a constant calm in their increasingly lively household. "Let Daddy catch his breath." The boys immediately climbed onto the bench beside him, one on each side, their small bodies warm against his arms. 6 months ago, this kind of casual physical affection would have felt foreign, awkward. Now it felt like breathing. "Miss Nora," Lucas said, turning to her with the serious expression he wore when asking important questions, "are you going to stay forever?" The question hung in the air, innocent yet loaded with the weight of too many departures. Damien felt his chest tighten, not with the old, familiar panic, but with something else, something that felt dangerously close to hope. Nora marked her place in the book and gave Lucas her full attention. "What would forever look like to you? Like, always being here when we wake up, and making pancakes on Sundays, and reading stories when we're scared?" Lucas paused, thinking, "and teaching Daddy how to play games." "I don't need to be taught," Damien protested mildly, though they all knew it wasn't entirely true. Work had consumed him for so long that he'd forgotten how to simply exist in moments like these. "Yes, you do," Liam said matter-of-factly. "Yesterday you tried to make hide-and-seek have rules." "Hide-and-seek should have rules," Damien argued, but he was smiling. "The only rule is fun," Nora said, her green eyes twinkling. "Though I admit, Mr. Whitmore's version would probably involve spreadsheets and performance metrics." "Hide-and-seek efficiency ratings," Damien said solemnly, "ranked by hiding spot creativity and discovery time." The boys dissolved into giggles and Nora laughed, that warm, unguarded sound that had become the soundtrack to their new normal. "See?" Lucas said triumphantly. "You do need teaching." As the afternoon wore on, Damien found himself studying Nora when she wasn't looking. She'd changed their lives so completely that it was hard to remember what the house had felt like before her. The boys adored her, yes, but it was more than that. She'd brought something indefinable to their home, not just care or competence, but presence, the sense that someone was truly, fully there. Mrs. Henderson had quit 2 weeks ago, claiming that the household standards had become unacceptably relaxed. Damien hadn't bothered to replace her. Nora had quietly expanded her role without being asked, handling everything from meal planning to bedtime stories with the same gentle efficiency she brought to everything else. Mr. Whitmore? Her voice pulled him from his thoughts. The boys had wandered off to examine a butterfly, giving them a moment of relative privacy. Can I ask you something? Of course. When was the last time you took a real day off? Not working from home? Not checking emails between games, a complete break? Damien considered the question. I honestly can't remember. Before Isabella died, certainly. Maybe 2 years? 3? The boys start preschool next month. Yes. He'd been dreading it. The transition, the new routine, the possibility that being around other children might trigger setbacks. What if we did something special before then? A day trip somewhere. Just the 3 of you. I couldn't ask you to. You're not asking, I'm suggesting. Nora's voice was gentle but firm. They need to see that you can be present with them outside these walls. And you need to remember that the world won't end if you're unreachable for a few hours. Damien felt that familiar resistance, the voice in his head that catalogued all the reasons why stepping away was impossible. But then, he looked at his sons, watched Liam carefully cup his hands around the butterfly so Lucas could see it better, saw the patience and gentleness they showed each other, qualities he was still learning from them. Where would we go? There's a children's museum about an hour north, very hands-on, very loud, very chaotic. Nora smiled. Everything your house usually isn't. That sounds terrifying. It should be perfect then. Later that evening, after the boys were asleep, peacefully in their own beds, after a story and without tears, miracles Damien no longer took for granted, he found Nora in the kitchen preparing tomorrow's lunch. Nora. Her name felt different in his mouth now. Less formal, more familiar. Can I ask you something? She looked up from the sandwiches she was making, waiting. Lucas asked if you were going to stay forever. You never really answered him. No, she said quietly. I didn't. Why? Nora was silent for a long moment, her hands still. Because I don't know what forever means in a situation like this. I'm the housekeeper who became something more because your family needed something more. But what happens when you don't need me anymore? When they're older, more independent? When you... She trailed off. When I what? When you're ready to move forward. Really move forward. You'll want to build a new life, maybe meet someone who can be a real mother to the boys, not just what? Damien's voice was sharper than he'd intended. Not just the woman who saved my sons. Who brought laughter back to this house? Who taught me how to be a father again? Nora looked at him, something unreadable in her expression. I'm not their mother, Damien. The use of his first name sent a jolt through him. Intimate, unexpected, charged with meaning neither of them had acknowledged until now. No, he said quietly, but you're something else. Something I never expected to find. The words hung between them, loaded with possibility and danger in equal measure. Outside, Seattle sparkled in the darkness, millions of lives intersecting in countless ways. But inside this kitchen, 2 people who'd found each other in the midst of grief stood on the precipice of something entirely new. Something that would change everything once again. The Children's Museum was exactly as chaotic as Nora had promised. Damien stood in the entrance, watching his son's eyes widen at the controlled pandemonium before them. Kids climbed through massive jungle gyms, splashed in water tables, and shrieked with delight as they raced through interactive exhibits. The noise level alone would have sent him fleeing 6 months ago. Today he found himself smiling. Can we go everywhere? Lucas asked, practically vibrating with excitement. We have all day, Damien replied, and meant it. His phone was in the car, deliberately left behind on Nora's gentle insistence. For the first time in years, he was completely unreachable. Race you to the dinosaur dig, Liam called out, already running toward a sandbox filled with buried fossils. What followed was 3 hours of pure, unfiltered joy. Damien found himself crawling through toddler-sized tunnels, building elaborate structures in the block room, and getting thoroughly soaked at the water play area. His expensive casual clothes, carefully chosen for their appropriate but approachable image, were ruined within the first hour. He'd never cared less about anything in his life. "Daddy, look," Lucas called from inside a miniature grocery store where he was very seriously checking out plastic vegetables. "I'm working like you. Much more important job than mine," Damien said, playing along as he handed over pretend money. "Food is essential. Financial portfolios, less so." A woman nearby smiled at the interaction. "He's adorable. They both are. You can see how much they adore their dad." The compliment hit differently than it would have months ago. Because it was true now. His sons did adore him, and more importantly, he was present enough to see it. By lunchtime, both boys were pleasantly exhausted, their faces flushed with happiness and exertion. They sat in the museum cafe, sharing chicken nuggets and chocolate milk, recounting their favorite exhibits with the dramatic flair of seasoned adventurers. "This was the best day ever," Liam declared, syrup somehow already coating his fingers despite having eaten no syrup-containing foods. Ever, Damien asked seriously. Ever, Lucas confirmed. "Can we come back?" "Absolutely." As they prepared to leave, Lucas tugged on Damien's shirt. "Daddy, I wish Miss Nora was here." "Me too, buddy." "Why?" "Because she makes everything more fun. And she would have loved the butterfly garden." Damien's chest tightened. Not with the old familiar pain, but with something else entirely. The realization that his son was right, that every good moment now felt incomplete without Nora's presence, her gentle laughter, her way of finding wonder in the smallest things. The drive home was quiet, both boys drowsing in their car seats, exhausted from their adventure. Damien found his thoughts drifting to Nora, how she'd smiled when suggesting this trip, how she'd insisted he needed to remember what it felt like to just be present with his children. She'd been right, as usual. They arrived home as the sun was setting, painting the Seattle skyline in shades of gold and pink. Nora met them at the door, her face lighting up at the sight of their disheveled, happy trio. "How was the adventure?" she asked, kneeling to hug both boys. "Amazing," they chorused, immediately launching into overlapping accounts of their day. Damien watched her listen to every detail with the same attention she'd give a business presentation, asking questions and exclaiming at all the right moments. After dinner and baths, necessary after the museum's hands-on experiences, the boys settled into their bedtime routine with unusual contentment. They were tired in the best way, from play, from joy, from a day filled with new experiences and undivided attention. "Will you read tonight, Daddy?" Liam asked as they climbed into their beds. It was a request that had become routine over the past weeks, but tonight it felt different, more natural, less like therapy and more like family. Damien settled between their beds with a worn copy of Goodnight Moon, Isabella's old favorite that had sat untouched for 18 months. As he read, his sons' breathing slowed, their faces relaxed into peaceful sleep. He found Nora in the living room afterward, curled up on the couch with her book and a cup of tea. She looked up as he entered, her expression soft in the lamplight. "Good day?" she asked. "The best." He settled into the chair across from her, suddenly reluctant to end the evening. "Thank you for pushing me to do it." "You didn't need pushing. You just needed permission to believe the world wouldn't end if you stepped away from work for one day." "It's more than that." Damien leaned forward, searching for the right words. 6 months ago, I was terrified of being alone with my own children. Not because I didn't love them, but because I didn't know how to love them anymore. Everything felt broken, including me. Nora set down her book, giving him her full attention. Today, watching them explore, seeing their excitement, I remembered what it felt like to just be their father. Not the grieving widower, not the guilty parent who couldn't fix their pain. Just, Dad. "You were always their dad," Nora said gently. "You just forgot for a while. You helped me remember." The words came out more intense than he'd intended, loaded with everything he'd been feeling but couldn't quite voice. "You've helped all of us remember how to be a family." Something shifted in Nora's expression, a flicker of something vulnerable, hopeful, quickly masked. "That's what you hired me for," she said lightly, but her voice caught slightly on the words. "No." Damien stood up, moving closer. "I hired you to clean my house. You chose to heal my family. There's a difference." They were standing closer now than they'd ever been, the space between them charged with months of growing connection, shared moments, unspoken feelings that had built slowly, naturally, inevitably. "Damien," Nora's voice was barely a whisper. "I know this is complicated," he said quietly. "I know there are boundaries. expectations, 100 reasons why this doesn't make sense. But today, when Lucas said he wished you were there, I realized something. What? I wish you were there too. Not just today, but everywhere. Every adventure, every ordinary moment, every time something wonderful happens, and I want to share it with someone who understands why it matters. Nora's eyes were bright with unshed tears. I can't be a replacement for her. For Isabella, I would never ask you to be. Damien reached out, gently touching her hand. You're not a replacement for anything. You're just you. And somehow, that's exactly what we needed. Outside, the city hummed with its endless activity. Millions of people living their separate lives. But inside this living room, two people who'd found healing in unexpected places stood on the edge of something beautiful and terrifying. Something that would either complete their healing or shatter everything they'd built. The choice was theirs to make. The moment shattered like glass. Nora pulled her hand back as if Damien's touch had burned her, taking a step away that felt like miles. The vulnerability in her eyes was replaced by something else. Panic, retreat, the familiar armor of someone who'd learned that hope was dangerous. I can't, she whispered, shaking her head. This is exactly what I was afraid of. Damien felt the words like a physical blow. Afraid of what? This. She gestured between them, her voice growing stronger but more distant. Getting too close. Crossing lines that can't be uncrossed. I'm your employee, Damien. You're grieving, the boys are vulnerable, and I'm just the help who got too involved. You know that's not true. Do I? Nora's green eyes flashed with something raw, painful. Because from where I stand, this feels like a man who's grateful for what I've done for his children. Maybe confused about what that gratitude means. And I won't be someone's rebound from grief. The accusation hit harder because it contained just enough truth to sting. 6 months ago, Damien might have questioned his own motives. Wondered if his feelings were real or just relief at finding someone who could help his sons heal. But not now. Not after weeks of watching her laugh with his children, of seeing her face light up when they mastered something new, of finding himself looking forward to the small moments when their hands would brush as they worked together in the kitchen. That's not what this is, he said quietly, and I think you know that. Nora wrapped her arms around herself, a gesture of self-protection that broke his heart. What I know is that I've made a mistake. I've let myself care too much, get too attached. The boys depend on me, and I've let my own feelings compromise that. Your feelings for them or your feelings for me? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with everything neither had been willing to acknowledge until now. Both, she admitted, and the honesty in her voice was devastating. I love them like they're my own. And she stopped, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence. And you? And I've fallen for their father in a way that terrifies me. The words came out in a rush, like a confession torn from deep inside her. There. Are you happy? I've crossed every professional boundary, fallen for a man who's still wearing his wedding ring, and convinced myself that what we have is real when it's probably just circumstance. Damien looked down at his left hand, at the platinum band he'd worn for 7 years. He'd stopped noticing it months ago, but Nora was right. It was still there, a visible reminder of vows that death had ended, but habit had preserved. I haven't taken it off because I was afraid, he said slowly. Not afraid of forgetting Isabella, but afraid of what taking it off would mean. That I was ready to live again instead of just surviving. And are you ready? The question was simple, but the answer encompassed everything. His grief, his guilt, his growing feelings for the woman standing before him, his responsibility to his children, his fear of making the wrong choice when so much hung in the balance. I thought I was, he said honestly. But maybe you're right. Maybe this is too complicated, too risky. Maybe we should... Mr. Damien? Miss Nora? Lucas's small voice from the doorway froze them both. He stood in his dinosaur pajamas, clutching his stuffed elephant, his hair mussed from sleep. Hey, buddy, Damien said, immediately shifting into father mode. What's wrong? Bad dream? I heard talking, Lucas said, looking between them with the uncanny perception children sometimes possess. Are you fighting? No, sweetheart, Nora said quickly, but her voice was strained. We were just discussing some grown-up things. Are you leaving? The question was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of every abandonment these children had experienced. I'm not going anywhere tonight, Nora said, kneeling to his level. You should be sleeping. But tomorrow? Are you leaving tomorrow? The silence stretched too long. Nora's hesitation was answer enough for a 3-year-old who'd learned to read the signs of impending departure. I knew it, Lucas said, his eyes filling with tears. Everybody leaves, even when they promise they won't. Lucas, that's not… Damien started, but his son was already running back toward his room. They found him curled up in his bed, sobbing into his pillow while Liam sat beside him, patting his back with the solemn comfort only twins could provide. She's leaving like Mommy left, Lucas cried. Like Mrs. Henderson left. Like all the other ladies left. Miss Nora isn't leaving, Liam said firmly, though his own eyes were wide with worry. Right, Miss Nora? You said you'd stay. Nora knelt beside the bed, her own tears threatening to fall. Oh, boys. You promised, Lucas accused, lifting his tear-streaked face. You said we could make pancakes on Sunday. You said you'd teach me to tie my shoes. You said you'd be here. I wanted to be, Nora whispered. I want to be here more than anything. Then why can't you stay? It was Liam who asked the question that cut to the heart of everything, the innocent logic of a child who couldn't understand why adults made simple things so complicated. Damien watched Nora struggle for an answer that would make sense to a 3-year-old, when it barely made sense to the adults involved. He saw the moment she broke, the moment her carefully constructed walls crumbled under the weight of 2 little boys who just wanted someone to stay. Because sometimes grown-ups make things complicated when they should be simple, she said finally, looking not at the boys, but at Damien. Sometimes we're so afraid of making mistakes that we forget what really matters. What really matters? Lucas asked, sniffling. Nora was quiet for a long moment, then reached out to smooth his hair. Love, she said simply. Love matters. Being brave enough to love people even when it's scary, even when you might get hurt, even when you don't know what's going to happen next. Do you love us? Liam asked. More than anything in the world. Then stay, Lucas said, as if it were the most obvious solution imaginable. If you love us, just stay. From the mouths of babes came the truth that adults spent months dancing around. As Nora read them back to sleep, her voice soft but steady, Damien stood in the doorway and realized that some decisions weren't complicated at all. Some choices were as simple as choosing love over fear. The question was whether both of them would be brave enough to make it. Damien couldn't sleep. He stood in his walk-in closet at 3 a.m., staring at the small velvet box he'd retrieved from the back of his jewelry drawer. Inside lay Isabella's wedding ring, the one the hospital had given him along with her other belongings, the one he'd been unable to look at for 18 months. His own ring felt heavier tonight, more present on his finger than it had in months. Lucas's innocent question echoed in his mind. If you love us, just stay. But it wasn't that simple, was it? Love came with complications, expectations, the weight of promises made and unmade. The gold band on his finger represented 7 years of devotion to a woman who'd been everything to him. Wife, partner, mother of his children, the architect of the life they'd built together. Taking it off felt like betrayal. Keeping it on felt like cowardice. Down the hall he could hear Nora moving quietly in the guest room she'd been using since that first night she'd stayed. She hadn't left after putting the boys to bed, but she hadn't spoken to him either. They existed in careful politeness, orbiting each other like planets afraid of collision. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. He turned to find Nora in the doorway, still in her clothes from earlier, her hair loose around her shoulders. I saw your light on, she said quietly. Couldn't sleep either. Not really. He closed the jewelry box, but she'd already seen it. Isabella's ring? He nodded. I kept it, told myself I'd give it to the boys someday. But really, I couldn't let it go. Nora stepped into the closet, her presence both comforting and electric in the intimate space. Can I see it? Damien hesitated, then opened the box. Isabella's ring caught the light. A classic solitaire, elegant and timeless, chosen by a 26-year-old man who'd thought he had forever figured out. It's beautiful, Nora said, her voice soft. She had lovely taste. She would have liked you. The words surprised him with their truth. She always said the best people were the ones who loved without expecting anything in return. Like with the boys, like with all of us. They stood in silence, the weight of the past and the uncertainty of the future heavy between them. I've been thinking about what Lucas said, Nora finally spoke, about loving people even when it's scary. And I think I've been scared for so long that I forgot what it felt like to be brave. She looked at him, her green eyes vulnerable in the soft light. My parents died when I was 16. Car accident. I went to live with my grandmother, but she was already sick. Cancer. I spent 3 years watching her fade away, and when she died, Damien's chest tightened. You were alone. Completely. And I swore I'd never put myself in that position again, loving someone so much that losing them would destroy me. She laughed bitterly. So I kept everyone at arm's length, took jobs that were temporary, never let myself get too attached to places or people. Until us. Until you. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. I told myself it was just the boys, that I was helping grieving children. But somewhere along the way, watching you learn to play again, seeing you choose your family over work, listening to you read bedtime stories, you fell in love with a grieving widower who was too broken to see what was right in front of him. Nora's breath caught. Are you saying? Instead of answering, Damien slowly slipped the ring from his finger. The pale band of skin beneath was a reminder of how long he'd worn it, how long he'd hidden behind grief instead of choosing to live. I loved Isabella with everything I had, he said quietly, placing both rings in the velvet box. She gave me 7 beautiful years and 2 incredible sons. Nothing will ever change that. But she's gone. And somewhere in the last few months I realized that honoring her memory doesn't mean stopping my life. It means living fully enough for both of us. He looked at Nora, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was saying. Isabella would want me to be happy. More than that, she'd want the boys to grow up in a house filled with love, not one haunted by what we lost. Tears were running down Nora's cheeks now. Damien, I'm not asking you to replace her. I'm not asking you to be anything other than exactly who you are. He stepped closer, close enough to see the hope and fear warring in her expression. I'm asking if you're brave enough to build something new with us. Not as my employee, not as a temporary fix, but as what? As the woman I love, as someone who chooses to stay not because the boys need you, but because we all want you here. Because this house isn't home without you in it. The confession hung between them, raw and honest and terrifying. What if I'm not enough? Nora whispered. What if I can't be the mother they need, the partner you deserve? What if I disappoint everyone? What if you don't? Damien reached out, gently taking her hands. What if you're exactly what we need? What if the love you've already given us is proof that this could work? The boys adore you, trust you, sleep peacefully because you're here. Your work, your social circle, the difference in none of that matters. His voice was firm, certain. Money, status, expectations. None of it matters compared to this, compared to what you've brought to our lives. Nora stared at him, tears flowing freely now. You're really asking me to stay, permanently, as part of your family. I'm asking you to help me build a new kind of family, one where love matters more than convention, where healing is possible, where 2 broken people can become whole together. For a long moment, the only sound was the city humming beyond the windows. Millions of people sleeping while 2 others stood on the precipice of forever. I'm terrified, Nora whispered. So am I. What if we mess this up? What if loving each other ruins what we've built with the boys? What if it makes everything better? Damien countered. What if choosing love over fear is exactly what they need to see? Nora looked down at their joined hands, then back up at his face. This man who'd learned to play hide and seek, who read bedtime stories with voices for every character, who'd chosen his children over billion-dollar deals because a woman had shown him what truly mattered. Okay, she breathed. Okay, yes, I'll stay. I'll be brave enough to stay. The kiss that followed was soft, tentative, full of promise and possibility. It tasted like hope after grief, like sunrise after the longest night. When they broke apart, Damien rested his forehead against hers. I should probably ask you properly, he said, smiling. Ms. Bailey, would you consider a permanent position with the Whitmore family? The benefits include pancake-making privileges, bedtime story duties, and loving 3 boys who think you hung the moon. Nora laughed through her tears. What's the salary? More love than you'll know what to do with. I accept. And in the quiet of the night, 2 people who'd found each other through grief and healing chose to build something beautiful together. But their greatest test was still to come. 2 weeks of happiness felt like a lifetime, and an instant all at once. Nora woke each morning to the sound of small feet running down the hallway, to Lucas calling, Miss Nora, and Liam's infectious giggle as they burst into her room, now officially her room, not the guest room, filled with her books and photos and the soft throw pillows she'd bought to make it truly hers. The boys had adapted to the change with the resilience of children who'd found their safe harbor. They called her by her name now, but sometimes in moments of sleepy contentment or when seeking comfort, Mama Nora would slip out, tentative at first, then with growing confidence when they saw it brought smiles instead of corrections. Damien had become a different man entirely, still brilliant, still driven, but now his work served his life instead of consuming it. He came home for dinner every night, taught the boys to ride bikes in the building's courtyard, and fell asleep reading stories with voices that made them laugh until their sides hurt. At night, when the boys were asleep, Damien and Nora would sit together on the couch, her head on his shoulder, planning weekend adventures or simply existing in the comfortable silence of two people who'd found their missing piece. It was perfect, which was exactly why Nora should have known it couldn't last. The knock came on a Thursday morning while she was helping the boys with breakfast before their first day of preschool. They were nervous and excited in equal measure, chattering about new friends and wondering if their teacher would like the drawings they'd made. "I'll get it," Damien called from his office, where he was finishing a conference call. Nora was busy wiping syrup from Lucas's chin when she heard the voice in the foyer. Cultured, sharp, unmistakably disapproving. "Hello, Damien. You look, well," Nora's blood froze. She knew that voice from the photos scattered throughout the house, from the stories Damien had shared about family gatherings and holidays past. Margaret Whitmore, Damien's mother-in-law. Margaret. Damien's voice was carefully neutral. "This is unexpected. I was in Seattle on business and thought I'd see my grandsons." The words carried an edge that suggested this visit was anything but casual. "I hope that's all right." Through the kitchen doorway, Nora could see them. Margaret in an expensive coat and pearls, her silver hair perfectly styled, her posture radiating the kind of authority that came from old money and older expectations. Damien stood opposite her, tension visible in every line of his body. "Of course," he said. "The boys will be excited to see you. They're just finishing breakfast." "Wonderful. I've missed them terribly." Margaret's gaze swept the foyer, taking in changes Nora had made. Fresh flowers on the console table. The boys' artwork hung at child height. The general sense of a house being lived in rather than just maintained. "The place looks different." "Grandma Margaret!" Lucas's delighted shriek broke the tension as both boys raced into the foyer, their faces lighting up with genuine joy. Margaret's demeanor softened instantly as she knelt to embrace them, and for a moment Nora saw not the formidable woman she'd heard about, but a grandmother who genuinely loved her grandsons. "My beautiful boys," Margaret murmured, holding them close. "You've grown so much. And Liam, are you taller than Lucas now?" "By this much." Liam held up his fingers to show a tiny space, beaming with pride. "We're starting school today," Lucas announced. "Miss Nora helped us pick out our backpacks." The mention of her name caused Margaret's gaze to shift toward the kitchen, where Nora stood frozen in the doorway, a dish towel still in her hands. "Miss Nora?" Margaret's voice was politely curious, but her eyes were sharp, assessing. "This is Nora Bailey," Damien said, moving to stand beside Nora in a gesture of support that didn't go unnoticed. She helps with the house and the boys." The careful phrasing hurt more than it should have. After weeks of being part of the family, she was suddenly the help again, reduced to her original role by the presence of someone whose approval mattered. How lovely. Margaret's smile was perfectly polite and completely cold. "It's so important to have reliable staff, especially with young children." "Miss Nora isn't staff," Liam protested with 3-year-old indignation. "She's family. She makes pancakes and reads stories and helps Daddy laugh. And she's teaching me to tie my shoes," Lucas added, as if this was the most important qualification imaginable. Margaret's eyebrows rose nearly imperceptibly. How comprehensive. The judgment in those 2 words was subtle but unmistakable. Nora felt herself shrinking, all her old insecurities flooding back. What was she doing here? What had she been thinking, believing she could belong in this world of trust funds and private schools and women who wore pearls to casual visits? "Boys, why don't you show Grandma Margaret your room while Miss Nora gets ready for school?" Damien suggested, his voice tight. As the children led their grandmother upstairs, chattering excitedly about their toys and books, Damien turned to Nora with apology written all over his face. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I should have warned you she might visit. She has strong opinions about inappropriate relationships between employers and staff." Nora finished, her voice hollow. "About everything. She means well, but she's protecting her grandsons from someone she sees as a gold digger who's taking advantage of a grieving widower. That's not..." Isn't it? Nora set down the dish towel with careful precision. Look at this from her perspective, Damien. Her daughter dies, and 18 months later, she finds her son-in-law involved with the housekeeper. What would you think? Damien opened his mouth to argue, but the sound of footsteps on the stairs silenced him. Margaret returned with the boys, her expression thoughtful and slightly troubled. They're lovely children, she told Damien, though I notice they seem quite attached to Miss Bailey. Nora has been wonderful with them, Damien said firmly. I'm sure she has. Margaret's tone was perfectly reasonable, which somehow made it worse. Though I wonder if it's entirely appropriate for them to become so dependent on someone who is, ultimately, an employee. Children their age have difficulty understanding professional boundaries. There are no boundaries to understand, Liam said matter-of-factly. Miss Nora loves us and we love her, and Daddy loves her too. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret's face went through several expressions: surprise, understanding, and finally a cold kind of fury that she masked quickly but not quickly enough. I see, she said quietly. How modern. The word dripped with disapproval, and Nora felt something inside her die. This woman saw exactly what Nora had always feared others would see: someone who'd overstepped, someone who didn't belong, someone who'd taken advantage of a vulnerable family for her own gain. Margaret, Damien began, but she held up a perfectly manicured hand. Perhaps we could speak privately, Damien. I believe the boys need to get ready for school. It wasn't a request. As Nora helped the boys brush their teeth and gather their backpacks, she could hear the murmur of tense conversation from downstairs. She couldn't make out words, but the tone was clear. Margaret was not pleased with what she'd discovered. When they finally came downstairs, ready for their big day, the atmosphere in the house had changed completely. Margaret was perfectly cordial, kissing the boys goodbye and wishing them luck at school, but her eyes when they met Nora's were arctic. Miss Bailey, she said as they prepared to leave, perhaps we could chat sometime soon. I'd love to hear more about your background. The threat was politely wrapped, but unmistakable. As they walked to the car, the boys excitedly talking about their first day, Nora felt the weight of what had just happened settling over her like a shroud. She'd been living in a fairy tale, believing that love was enough to bridge the gap between their worlds. Margaret Whitmore had just reminded her that some gaps were too wide to cross. And as they drove toward the preschool, Nora couldn't shake the feeling that their perfect life was about to crumble, not from outside pressure, but from the doubts that Margaret's visit had awakened inside her own heart. The boys' first day of preschool should have been a celebration. Instead, Nora sat in her car outside the school building, watching Damien walk hand in hand with Liam and Lucas toward the entrance, and felt her heart breaking into 1,000 pieces. Margaret's words echoed in her mind. Children their age have difficulty understanding professional boundaries. The implication was clear. Nora had confused the boys, made them think she was something she wasn't, created an inappropriate attachment that would only hurt them in the long run. Maybe she was right. Her phone buzzed with a text from Damien. Coffee after drop-off? We need to talk. She stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, I think I should go home. Give the boys my love when you pick them up. But instead of going to her apartment, Nora found herself driving to the small cemetery where her grandmother was buried. She sat on the bench beside the headstone, surrounded by the peaceful quiet that always helped her think. I don't know what to do, Grandma, she whispered to the carved marble. I thought I was helping them heal, but maybe I just made everything more complicated. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of autumn and change. Her grandmother had always said that love wasn't about what was easy, it was about what was right. But how could Nora know what was right when her heart and her head were pulling her in opposite directions? Her phone rang. Damien, where are you? His voice was tight with worry. I've been calling. I needed some air, some space to think. About what Margaret said. It wasn't a question. He knew her well enough by now to understand how her mind worked, how easily her old insecurities could be triggered. She's not wrong, Damien. Look at us objectively. A billionaire and his housekeeper. 2 grieving children caught in the middle. It sounds like the beginning of a cautionary tale. It sounds like the beginning of a love story. His voice was firm, certain. Nora, don't let her fears become yours. What if she's right? What if I've confused the boys, made them think I'm something I'm not? What if I'm just a band-aid on their grief? And when they're older, they'll realize, stop. The word was sharp enough to cut through her spiral. Do you want to know what happened after I dropped them off? Nora waited. afraid to hope, afraid not to. Lucas cried, not because he was scared of school, but because he wanted to show you his classroom. Liam asked the teacher if you could come for show and tell because you're the most important person in our family now. Tears slipped down Nora's cheeks. Damien, they love you, not as their housekeeper, not as a replacement for their mother, but as the woman who stayed when everyone else left. As the person who made our house feel like home again. But what if Margaret tries to? Margaret can try whatever she wants, but she doesn't get to decide who belongs in our family. Only we do. The conviction in his voice made her chest tight with hope and fear in equal measure. Where are you? He asked again. Riverside Cemetery, Section C. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Don't move. He found her exactly where she'd said she'd be, sitting beside a simple granite headstone that read, Eleanor Bailey, beloved grandmother. She loved without limits. Damien settled beside her on the bench, not touching but close enough that she could feel his warmth. Tell me about her, he said quietly. She raised me after my parents died, taught me that love wasn't about blood or marriage certificates or social expectations. It was about showing up, every day, even when it was hard. Nora touched the carved letters of her grandmother's name. She would have liked you, and she would have loved the boys. What would she tell you to do right now? Nora smiled through her tears. Probably to stop being an idiot and fight for what matters. Smart woman. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching clouds drift across the Seattle sky. Finally, Damien spoke. Margaret called me after she left this morning. She wants to take the boys to stay with her in San Francisco for a few weeks, to assess the situation and ensure their well-being. Nora's blood went cold. She can do that. She can try. She has no legal rights, but she has money and connections and the kind of lawyers who make problems for people like us. Damien's jaw was tight. She also made it clear that if I choose to continue this relationship with you, she'll make things very difficult. Then maybe I should. If you say you should leave, I'm going to lose my mind. Damien turned to face her fully. Nora, I love you. Not because you saved my family, not because you're good with my children, but because you're you. Because you make me want to be better. Because when I imagine the rest of my life, you're in every single moment of it. But the boys need stability. They need love. They need the woman who taught them it was okay to grieve and okay to heal and okay to love again. He reached for her hands. They need their father to be brave enough to choose happiness over fear. And if Margaret follows through on her threats, then we fight. Together. As a family. Damien's voice was stronger than she'd ever heard it. I spent 18 months letting grief make my decisions. I'm not going to let fear do the same thing. Nora stared at him. This man who'd learned to play again because she'd shown him how. Who'd chosen love over work because she'd made him see what truly mattered. What are you asking me to do? I'm asking you to marry me. The words hung in the air between them. Simple and complicated and earth-shattering all at once. Damien. Not because it would solve the problem with Margaret, though it would make her threats considerably less effective. Not because the boys need a mother, though they do, but because I can't imagine a future without you in it. He slipped off the bench, kneeling in the grass beside her grandmother's grave. I'm asking you to marry me, because I love you beyond reason, beyond fear, beyond anything that makes sense on paper. I don't have a ring to offer you right now, he continued, his voice thick with emotion. I don't have a speech prepared or a grand gesture planned. I just have 3 boys who love you completely and a heart that's yours whether you want it or not. Nora looked down at him, this powerful man kneeling in cemetery grass, offering her everything he had to give, and felt her grandmother's voice whispering in the wind. Love without limits. You're sure? She asked, her voice barely audible, even knowing what we'll face. The judgment, the questions, the battles we'll have to fight, especially knowing that. Damien's eyes were bright with unshed tears. Because you're worth fighting for. We're worth fighting for. Nora closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the decision settle over her like a blanket. When she opened them again, her choice was clear. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. The kiss that followed was tender and desperate and full of promise. When they broke apart, Damien rested his forehead against hers. We should probably pick up the boys, he said softly. I have a feeling they're going to have some strong opinions about wedding planning. Nora laughed through her tears. They're going to want to help with everything. Good. It's their family too. As they walked back to their cars hand in hand, Nora felt her grandmother's presence like a blessing. Eleanor Bailey had been right about many things, but especially about this. Love wasn't about what was easy or expected or socially acceptable. It was about showing up, every day, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. And as they drove toward the preschool to collect two little boys who would be over the moon to hear their news, Nora knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, as a family. Where love lives. 2 years later, the laughter echoing through the Whitmore house on a Sunday morning would have been impossible to imagine 3 years ago. Nora stood at the kitchen window, her hands resting on her growing belly, watching her husband chase their 6-year-old sons through the backyard garden. Damien had grass stains on his jeans and flour in his hair from their morning pancake-making session, and he looked happier than she'd ever seen him. "Daddy, you're too slow," Lucas called out, his gap-toothed grin bright with mischief. "Yeah, you gotta run faster," Liam added, spinning in circles with his arms outstretched like an airplane. "I'm conserving energy," Damien called back, dramatically clutching his chest. "Your baby sister is stealing all my speed." Both boys dissolved into giggles at this explanation, as they did every time he blamed some silly behavior on their unborn sister. The baby kicked as if in response, and Nora smiled, placing a gentle hand over the movement. Isabella Rose Whitmore was due in 3 months. Named for the mother the boys remembered with love rather than sadness now, and for the roses that bloomed year-round in their garden, a reminder that beautiful things could grow from the most unlikely ground. The wedding had been small, intimate, held in that same garden on a crisp October day. Liam and Lucas had been ring-bearers, proud as peacocks in their little suits, and their joy had been so infectious that even Margaret had been forced to smile. The older woman had made her peace with the marriage eventually, once she'd seen how genuinely happy the boys were, how settled and secure they'd become. She still had opinions, she always would, but she kept them to herself now, choosing her grandson's happiness over her own preconceptions. "Mrs. Whitmore," came a familiar voice from the doorway. Nora turned to find Teresa, their part-time housekeeper, holding a steaming cup of chamomile tea. The older woman had been with them for over a year now, taking care of the cleaning so Nora could focus on being a wife and mother, roles that still felt wonderfully surreal some days. "Teresa, how many times do I have to tell you? It's just Nora. And how many times do I have to tell you that after watching you turn this house into a home, you've earned every bit of respect that title carries?" Teresa smiled, handing her the tea. "Besides, those boys of yours need to hear that you're Mrs. Whitmore. Helps them understand that you're not going anywhere." Through the window they could see Damien had caught both boys and was spinning them around while they shrieked with delight. The sound drew neighbors to their windows, not in annoyance but with smiles. The Whitmore house had become known in the building as the place where children's laughter lived. "Sometimes I still can't believe this is my life," Nora admitted, settling into the breakfast nook where the family shared their meals every day. "Believe it, honey. You earned every bit of this happiness." The boys burst through the patio doors then, cheeks flushed and eyes bright, followed by Damien, who looked equally wind-blown and joyful. "Mama Nora!" Liam launched himself at her, careful of her belly as he'd been taught. "Baby sister kicked. I felt her. She's gonna be a soccer player," Lucas declared with authority. "Just like me when I grow up." "Or a dancer," Liam countered. "Like the ladies on TV who spin around pretty." "She can be whatever she wants to be," Nora said, smoothing their hair. "Just like you two." Damien settled beside her, pressing a kiss to her temple. "How are my girls this morning?" "Active." Nora laughed as another kick made her wince slightly. "I think she's excited about Uncle Trevor's visit next week." Her younger brother, now 22, and in his final year of college, had become a beloved fixture in their lives. The family she'd thought she'd lost forever had grown to include not just Damien and the boys, but a chosen family of friends, colleagues, and neighbors who'd watched their love story unfold with genuine affection. "Can we show him our fort?" Lucas asked eagerly. "And teach him to make pancakes? And show him the pictures of when Daddy couldn't play hide-and-seek, right?" Liam added with a grin. "Hey now," Damien protested mildly. "I've gotten much better at hide-and-seek." "You have," Nora agreed solemnly, "though you still try to make it educational sometimes. Learning should be fun. Playing should be playing," both boys chorused, having heard this debate many times before. As the morning wore on, the house filled with the comfortable chaos of family life. Homework was spread across the dining room table while the boys worked on their reading, occasionally asking for help with difficult words. Damien sat with his laptop, working on a presentation for Monday's meeting, but his attention was mostly on his sons, helping them sound out syllables and celebrating each small victory. Nora curled up on the couch with a book, though she spent more time watching her family than reading. These quiet moments still amazed her. The easy way Damien shifted between work and fatherhood, the boys' complete security in knowing both parents were present and engaged, the sense of peace that filled their home like morning light. Her phone buzzed with a text from her friend Sarah, a teacher at the boys' school. "Still on for lunch Tuesday? Can't wait to hear how you're feeling." Nora smiled, typing back, "Absolutely. Fair warning. If Isabella keeps kicking like this, I may need help getting out of restaurant booths." The reply came quickly. "Worth it to see you this happy. You're glowing, by the way." She was glowing, Nora realized. Not just with pregnancy, but with the deep contentment that came from a life well lived. Love freely given and received. A future bright with possibility. "Mama Nora?" Lucas appeared beside the couch, his expression serious. "Can I ask you something?" "Always, sweetheart." "Do you think our first mommy would like our baby sister?" The question, innocent and profound, made Nora's heart squeeze. The boys spoke of Isabella often now, not with the desperate grief of those early days, but with the fond remembrance of children who understood that love didn't end with death. "I think," Nora said carefully, "that your first mommy would be so proud of the big brothers you're going to be. And I think she'd love knowing that your baby sister is being born into a family full of love." "Good," Lucas nodded decisively, "because I want to tell baby sister about her, about how she had two mommies who loved her, one in heaven and one right here." Tears pricked Nora's eyes. "I think that's beautiful, Lucas. Baby sister is very lucky to have such a thoughtful big brother." As afternoon melted into evening, they settled into their Sunday routine, family movie night with popcorn and blankets piled on the couch. The boys snuggled against Nora's sides while Damien's arm wrapped around them all, creating a cocoon of warmth and safety. Halfway through the movie, both boys fell asleep, their small bodies relaxed and trusting. Damien carefully carried Liam to bed while Nora managed Lucas, their nighttime routine now so natural it felt like they'd been doing it forever. "Story?" Liam mumbled sleepily as Nora tucked him in. "How about the one about the prince who learned to play again?" she suggested, sitting on the edge of his bed. "And the princess who stayed," Lucas added from his bed across the room, his eyes already drooping. "Once upon a time," Nora began, her voice soft in the darkened room, "there was a prince who forgot how to smile." She told their story, transformed into fairy tale language but recognizably theirs, about grief and healing, about choosing love over fear, about a family that grew not from blood alone but from the decision to show up for each other every single day. By the time she finished, both boys were fast asleep, their breathing even and peaceful. Damien was waiting for her in their bedroom, already changed into pajamas, his laptop finally closed for the night. "Good day?" he asked, pulling her into his arms. "The best," she said, meaning it completely. "Even with Margaret's phone call about Thanksgiving plans?" "Even with that?" Nora laughed, "though I still can't believe she wants to coordinate a seating chart for a family dinner. She means well, in her own very particular way. I know, and the boys love her. That's what matters." They settled into bed together, Damien's hand finding its usual resting place on her belly, where their daughter continued her evening gymnastics routine. "She's going to be trouble," he murmured, as a particularly strong kick made them both laugh. "She's going to be perfect," Nora corrected, "just like her brothers, just like this whole beautiful, complicated, wonderful life we've built." "No regrets?" Damien asked, his voice soft in the darkness. "Not a single one," Nora replied without hesitation. "This is exactly where I'm supposed to be." Outside their window, Seattle hummed with its endless energy, millions of lives intersecting in countless ways. But inside their home, 4 people, soon to be 5, slept peacefully, surrounded by love that had grown from the most unlikely beginnings. And in the morning, there would be pancakes and laughter, and the ordinary magic of a family choosing each other, again and again, one day at a time. Some love stories begin with grand gestures or dramatic meetings. The best ones begin with someone deciding to stay. What touched you most about Damien and Nora's journey? Did their story remind you that sometimes the most beautiful relationships grow from the simplest act of showing up when someone needs you most? Your participation in this channel is very important. Please leave your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below letting us know what you thought. Your feedback and support mean a lot to us. Stay tuned for more exciting stories.